Okay, so welcome to the April APCG online colloquium. Thank you all for being here, really appreciate it. Today we're going to be discussing Lindsey Pruett's paper, Draft Dodgers and Volunteers, Ephemeral State Capacity and Colonial Military Recruitment from 1919 to 1938. So Lindsey's a PhD candidate at Cornell University. Lindsey, we really appreciate you sharing your work with us. It's fantastic, so really appreciate that. We're also very lucky to have two fantastic discussants with us today. So first we have Dr. Joan Ricart-Huguet, who is an assistant professor at Loyola University, Maryland, and his research focuses on the political legacies of colonialism and also how culture shapes socio-political behavior. We're also very lucky to have with us Dr. Dominika Koter, who's an associate professor of political science at Colgate University. Her research examines electoral competition, clientelism, and how ethnic identity and social bonds shape voting behavior. So thank you so much both for joining us and for being discussants for Lindsey's paper. So my name is Alicia Prisky. I'm one of the APCG online colloquium organizers. So I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. So just to give a brief idea of how things will look, we're going to start with Lindsey giving us a quick 5-minute overview of her paper and some of the background and goals for the paper. We'll then turn to our discussants. We'll each have about 10 to 15 minutes to discuss the paper. And then we'll give Lindsey just a few minutes to respond to those comments before we open up the discussion to everyone else. So thank you all for taking the time to be here. And Lindsey, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you all for coming. I was really looking forward to sharing some of the paper and some of what I've been working on for a while now. My name is Lindsey Pruett. I'm at Cornell. My broad interests generally are in understanding kind of state building through the lens of military development, not necessarily only in the colonial world. I'm largely supposedly writing a dissertation on post-colonial military development in West Africa. Pandemics happen, so I'm now kind of thinking about new ways to kind of go back to these kind of colonial questions that I've been dealing with earlier on in my PhD and how to kind of incorporate those into my post-pandemic dissertation world. Hopefully I'll be able to go back to Senegal and finish some of that other exciting work. But in the meantime, it's been good to go back and kind of revisit some of this work that you're seeing here today. The paper itself, I envision as kind of a standalone descriptive piece of data that I've gathered. As you may imagine, the data that I collected is not amenable to any kind of straightforward causal legacy story over time. It's just the nature of French colonialism. So I don't know exactly how that will place in any kind of journal, but we're going to work on it. And I am happy to hear more about your takes on this specific paper, but also more broadly, as I kind of go back and revisit kind of the work that I'm doing and how to reapproach some parts of my dissertation, I am curious broadly in what people are interested in, what they'd like to know more about, what they don't want to know more about, any of the above. So just happy to hear your thoughts. This paper itself, I start from a very basic kind of idea that militaries and the creation of militaries are one of the most foundational things that any state does. So understanding how people respond to something like the conscription or a draft tells us about the limits of the state, as well as where the state is kind of succeeding at those goals. And kind of more importantly, I am broadly interested in how African populations responded to the colonial state and the demands of the colonial state. So that's why I wanted in this paper to look at both when people evade the state, which I think is a pretty straightforward measure of state capacity, and also include this measure of volunteerism, which is a much messier version of kind of understanding state capacity. I'm aware of that. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. I'm happy to hear more from all of you. But I'm going to turn the floor over. I don't want to bias you with my own ideas of where the paper is strong or weak. I would prefer to hear what your take is. So thank you again for all being here, and I look forward to a good discussion.
Thanks, Lindsey. Yeah, we'll turn it over to Joan. Thank you.
Cool, great. Thanks, Lindsey, for organizing. I really enjoyed your paper, Lindsey, and it's one that when I was in grad school and I read Myron Eckenberg, I thought this is so interesting. You know, it's a type of work by historians that should have much more of an impact among historically inclined political scientists at the very least. And so when I stumbled upon your work, I thought, oh, that's, you know, someone heeded that call. So there, I found myself writing a lot of comments on the PDF, and so I'll share the PDF with you. Ignore or take up the comments as you see them fit. Here, I'll use the 10 minutes or so to give a couple of maybe broader picture comments. So I'll go perhaps I'll go straight into structuring the comments on your main three hypotheses, and then I'll give a couple more comments on that. So regarding hypothesis one, you find this increase in absentees across both types of borders, and I think that makes sense and is interesting. I think it builds on previous work by historians that underscores the mobility between French colonies within the Federation of French West Africa, and even between colonies of other empires, you know, say the Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire border. At the same time, I think there's a bit of work that needs to be done, perhaps theoretically or conceptually, to clarify. You describe multiple possible logics behind volunteerism. It's unclear if one dominates, if they actually lead to competing expectations. So that's in a sense maybe my criticism of your first hypothesis, that it concerns your outcome of volunteerism. I think the more general version of that comment is that obviously it's a working paper, and so I think perhaps there needs to be, as you dig deeper into the results, there needs to be a better tightening between the theory and the empirics more generally in the paper, right? But that's something that as you rewrite and examine further your data and so on, you will figure out, I think. But that's one example of where that could be stronger. Now for hypothesis two, your expectation is that the presence of a railroad will lead to more volunteers and less absentees, correct? Or at least that's what hypothesis two says, is that right? What you find, I believe, is that the presence of a railroad or the density of the railroad leads to more volunteers and more absentees. So as far as volunteers are concerned, I get by page 23 that corvée labor along the railroad may lead to more volunteers. Perhaps it's not obvious because there are centers of economic activity were precisely near railroad stations. You cite a couple of the Remy Jedouab and co-authors' papers, and so you might expect the opportunity cost of military service to be greater in those places. And so for military service to be less enticing, whereas we know that in some very rural areas far away from any railroad, military service both in British and French colonies, especially in British colonies where there wasn't conscription, you know, it was a way sometimes to ensure against bad crops, right? Or, you know, or a way to ensure against economic insecurity. That's the work of Timothy Parsons at WashU. So that's as far as volunteers are concerned in hypothesis two. As far as absentees, I think more absentees, which is what you find, contrary to what you predict less absentees with the presence of railroads, and you find that there are more absentees with the presence of railroads. I think that makes sense. To the extent that railroads provide economic opportunity, at least near railroad stations, perhaps you could refine the analysis to not just talk about railroads, but about railroad stations. That's in fact one of the things that Jedouab and co-authors do. Then we should see that more want to escape conscription. So I don't know if I'm rationalizing your results like post, but that would have definitely been my prior, I would think, based on the Jedouab et al. paper. And to the extent that men would otherwise have to do corvée labor, it also makes sense that you would have more absentees, right? Okay. And so regarding hypothesis 3, I won't say much about, except that you're examining a variable that's arguably pre-colonial, or perhaps measured right before the colonial period. It's a bit complicated because, yeah, anyway, we won't get into details about this pre-colonial state measure, which you also briefly touch upon. But I guess it wasn't clear to me, perhaps in the empirical results, to what extent you were including post-treatment controls. And so, you know, if it's a null finding, then that's fine. And I believe that it could very well be a null finding, but perhaps it's important to avoid post-treatment bias. Then, so these are my comments as far as the 3 hypotheses are concerned, you know. Then I have a couple of other different comments that I thought could be helpful, both empirically and conceptually. And perhaps the most important one is that the heterogeneity, not just across AOF colonies, but even within AOF colonies, is very much underplayed in this version of the paper. That is doing a disservice to all your efforts of data collection in 2 ways. First, from a purely kind of historical point of view, you know, between Dakar and Eastern Niger, the differences are massive, right? And so unpacking these vast differences between districts in AOF, which I noticed you call them provinces in the paper, but whatever, you know, cercle in French. But, you know, I think that would be important. That's in fact the key to the paper that I know you're aware with Rick McAlexander, that my paper with him. And, you know, state disengagement, we find this commonplace in the periphery, but not in the core of the colony, by which we mean coastal capital districts. And if I recall correctly, Eckenberg explains that fewer than expected were recruited, say, in Western Senegal, for instance, among the Wolof. And, you know, there are various reasons, you know, but in short, I would divide districts perhaps between richer ones, where joining the military is a burden, say Western Senegal, and those where it might be, quote unquote, an opportunity for social status, as you mentioned in the work of that some historians have found out, and for some guys like, say, Eastern Niger, where you have a lot more recruitment. So unpacking this spatial heterogeneity would be helpful empirically, but also to provide you a framework to perhaps tighten your hypothesis. For example, the railroad should lead to more absenteeism in the relatively developed districts, say St. Louis, Dakar, and so on, but less absenteeism in poor districts. You know, we can discuss that in more detail after the panel, whenever, after the colloquium, whenever. But that's, you know, unpacking the big heterogeneity within AOF. That I think is something that the paper would need to do. And then my last main comment, I don't want to take too much time, is you mentioned in the paper, but don't do necessarily a lot with it, besides controlling for it, that there are some policy changes, you know, from the more informal procedure to this draft lottery that was unsurprisingly resisted and so on. But why not leverage perhaps some of these policy changes to the extent that you think that is a reasonable thing to do, perhaps to do an event study, or to try to get more causal leverage by doing some sort of, you know, before and after comparison. And, you know, nobody's saying that this is perfectly clean and perfectly random, you know, so on. You know, I think that's, if you do historical work, you know the drill, right? But I think it could help you go further, right? And I think perhaps an event study would be more promising than a case study, insofar as you do have a couple of policy changes that seem interesting. Okay, then I have a couple of comments that are more on the, you know, on the quantitative side, on the models, and then a couple of minor comments, you know, clarifying notation and so on. But perhaps I'll stop here to not take too much time. And then if after everyone gets a chance to speak, then I can give you either during this seminar, if we don't have time, in writing the more econometric comments. I had a couple of those. Does that sound good? Cool. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the thoughtful comments. I'll just turn it over to Dominika. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alicia. And thank you, Lindsey, so much for giving us the opportunity to read this fascinating paper. Let me just first, congratulate you on the amazing data collection. I mean, I think it's really kudos to you. And I think, it addresses a really interesting question that speaks to the variation in responses to the colonial state, which I think is still under investigated. And there's some very interesting regional variation. I think my comments are actually somewhat compatible with what Joan said. It's sort of pushing you on some of the theoretical things. So I also had a comment about being more explicit early on in the paper about what the effects of railways are expected to be. I found that discussion somewhat confusing. And I wasn't exactly sure what to expect. And I think actually Jean gave some really good ideas about thinking, okay, well, does it really go, like thinking about, well, it could go this way, but, thinking about also opportunities. And do railways provide also exit options, right? Like physically exit options of actually escaping recruitment. So I think there is more that could be explored there because they do produce results. My second comment, like a multi, step comment, but really relates to the mix of conscription or the policy of conscription, and then the mix of recruits or draftees and volunteers. So the first thing I'll say is that I think you need a clearer description of the recruitment policy. And that also relates to Jean's question about, the variation over time and when there are policy changes. But I think having a very clear sense upfront about what the French were actually trying to accomplish would help me understand the African responses better. And I think I was trying to piece that together myself and sort of thinking about, what I might know. And so I think that has to be clearer. And in particular, explaining the mix of these two strategies. And I have to say that I think maybe throughout the paper, I never completely resolved how I think about, so I think the fact that there are, draftees and volunteers is really making it more difficult to make sense of it. And I think I've never resolved that tension. Parts of the paper, I'm like, oh, I think you should be just writing maybe about one. Then, there is this question of, are they independent of one another, right? Because you kind of treat them as, you have them as your two, dependent variables, but are they independent of one another? And I'm not entirely sure that that is the case. I think in this discussion of policy, I would like to see also, who was conscripted at what time, because there are these little pieces of information that we get when you sort of mention, oh, well, they didn't really want to recruit these people, or here they had a deal. I think I just wanted to have like a firmer overall picture of, okay, this is actually the policy on paper, both in, and that would include also who was being particularly targeted. Also you talk about the average rate of recruitment, and it wasn't clear to me what is the denominator for that. So, what is the pool of people that could be recruited? The other thing about, so I will say kind of a lot about volunteerism, and I think, so, and you mentioned this yourself, that I think that in terms of recruitment of draftees, it is easier to understand the response, right? And it's easier to sort of think of it as that the task of compelling people to do what you have told them to do is related to state capacity. I think this is harder with volunteers. So you seem to be taking a position that volunteerism is also a sign of state capacity. And you say that's, to coerce or to because it measures people's willingness to join. But I'm not sure that that is the case, right? So yes, compulsing people, the coercing people to join is very clearly related to state capacity, but making people willingly join, I think it's not completely clear. It could be, I kept on thinking that it could be a reflection of, of economic circumstances, and Joan alluded to that, right? So opportunities, it could be a sign of economic desperation. When I'm thinking about even volunteerism for the army in the US, it might be how you feel about the state. It might be about your personal economic circumstances. I just think that it's much more, it's more complicated. There is more, the expectation of economic benefits, right? You also said that they are compensated, right? So I think thinking through these things, is it actually really about, I don't know if thinking about compliance is the correct way of thinking. So I would really encourage you to think about what is this emblematic of? Like when we are measuring volunteerism, what is this a sign of? And I think there is quite a bit going on. I also had one question about the logic of the argument about pre-colonial centralization and recruitment. And I wasn't sure that is, and these results don't pan out. You sort of seem to be investing in this as a way of saying, well, a lot of people have focused on pre-colonial centralization, so I'm going to test it. I didn't really get a very strong sense of your own feelings on that. That's fine, but I actually wasn't sure that there should be a straightforward relationship between pre-colonial centralization and recruitment, because on the one hand, yes, in a way, pre-colonial centralization, if let's say the pre-colonial remaining traditional elites wanted to aid recruitment, then this would be an asset. But if they didn't, then it would be also an asset to discourage people from doing that. Often some of the areas, so if I'm thinking about Senegal, some of the areas with strongest levels of pre-colonial centralization, such as the Wall of Kingdoms, were also areas of very staunch opposition to the colonial state. So these things can be, so it's almost like you need both. You would maybe need two things: pre-colonial centralization and the decision to cooperate or not cooperate with the French at the very least. I was really sort of intrigued also by some of the temporal variation, and that made me wonder about other dynamics. And again, I think you sometimes relate to it and say, well, and in this particular time, maybe there was a drought or something, or something like that. But that really made me think that, there might be more to the sort of economic opportunities story, that perhaps actually temporal variation could give you a handle on, right? So if we have any good data on, I don't know, rainfall or droughts or even crop production, does that account for? So maybe that would free you up to actually, if that was already accounted for, it would help you zoom in on these other dynamics. And then the final thing I'm going to say is that I think that, well, it's a suggestion, that maybe you could make greater use of some also descriptive and qualitative material that I think you have collected from the archives, or at least a couple of times in the paper, in passing, you you quote remarks of French colonial officials, but it is really done in passing, and I actually found that to be fascinating in a sense, and I think maybe underdeveloped and underexploited in a sense that it gives you actually a glimpse in what they were trying to do, and also their own interpretation of why things were going the way they were going. So I would really sort of encourage you to mine the data more for that, and then and you know, that might give you insights into how they were interpreting this, and then see if that actually is borne out by the quantitative data that you have. So these are just some suggestions, but again, I think this is a really fascinating project. So I want to really commend you on this effort.
Thank you so much, Dominika. Thanks for those thoughtful comments. Lindsey, if you want, I just want to give you the opportunity, if you want to respond to any of those before we open it up to questions. You can also simply decline if you'd rather not.
No, I'm happy to say a little bit. I'll try to keep it short. So thank you both very much. These are all very well taken, and some of them are new to me, and some of them echo my own concerns. So part of the issue with the hypotheses and some of these things is that I feel this pressure to try to keep things as simple as possible, while also really wanting to bring in more of the richness and detail, because I have a tendency, as someone who spent a lot of time with historians, to get in the weeds, and I'm trying not to do that. So it's hard to find the balance. So thank you. And I'll work on finding that more. So in terms of policy changes, I can leverage those more. That's a good idea. Thank you for that. It's so complex. That is where I tend to get lost in the weeds, is thinking about how these policies change over time, where they do, where they don't. And so I should probably include a lot more on that. That was one of the things I tried to kind of shove to the side to try to keep it simpler for people who maybe had not thought about these kind of wide discrepancies across space within the AOF across Dakar to Niger. So broadly on the economic development points, I completely concur that a lot of people join because it makes sense for their family, for their, if you have a young son and you have a couple of young sons, definitely drill into the military. I think there are benefits to that. I really don't have a clear idea how to think about that in any kind of quantitative sense. So if anybody has ideas, let me know. So because a lot of the variables that we have end up kind of over determining a lot of what we want to know. So if you include rainfall in a study on Senegal, it's you're basically just controlling for Kédougou, and there's so little variation. You just have these kind of broad regional stripes that are the Sahel, not the Sahel, which is frustrating. And then kind of FAO soil data, I don't even know how I would interpret that. And I don't have clear measures of, and a clear idea of how I could get any kind of pre-treatment understanding or any kind of nuanced understanding of the economic variables here. So if anybody does, I'm happy to hear more about that. And Dominika, on your point about making better use of the descriptive data, I think that would be a good idea, because the descriptive and qualitative data is where I come to this kind of ambivalent position about the centralized regions, which is that in so much of the archival records that are left, the letters, every time there's a bump in volunteers, the French will say oh, it's really good that we had such great chiefs who were able to make that happen. Just across the board, whenever there were high numbers of chiefs, it was put on the shoulders of these elites for having done a good job at using propaganda and getting all of these young men to show up and comply, or I use the word comply. So I do see that as having been a way to kind of understand the role of, or at least that the French understood this as the role of elites within kind of making this extractive policy work. And that might be something that I can think about more, if that makes sense, but also draw on the qualitative data to make that case better if that's something that I decide I want to do. So those are some basic responses, and then I will stop talking for a second and let others join in.
Thanks, Lindsey. So I'll open it up to general questions now. So if you have a question, please feel free to either use the raise hand function, or you can message me just in the chat and I can call on you. Alex, please go ahead.
I really enjoyed reading this iteration of the paper. I think it's come quite a way from the last version that I saw. So I'm looking forward to kind of where it goes from here. One thing that I was thinking of is that you kind of focus a lot on variation within kind of local contexts. Thinking about kind of various geographic factors, various factors to do with the structure of traditional authority. And I was wondering whether you got a sense at all in looking at the kind of historical archival data that there's also variation in terms of the kind of people who are implementing these policies, right? I don't know a huge amount about French West Africa, but was decision-making kind of like decentralized to various colonial administrators who had a lot of power to kind of decide on strategies and to decide kind of, you know, if they were set a quota for how many people they needed to recruit, where they should be going to do it and who they should be going to do it? Or is there kind of a kind of more top-down, this is what you should be doing, and the kind of the agents of the colonial principles are kind of following that directive kind of to a T?
Thanks, Alex. Lindsey, I'll let you respond right away.
Yeah, so I have disagreements with people over this, but my read is that yes, there is a very top-down policy that gets put forward, but it ends up being negotiated between like the commandant of the cercle. I do use province because I've had people complain about too much French language, so to get rid of it. So the commandant will write letters to the lieutenant governor, who will then argue with the ministry in Paris about how quotas need to go about. When I gathered this data, that was not something I had in mind to think about, kind of thinking about differences across like individuals, which would be like have been a smart thing to do, but I didn't know that when I was a first year graduate student. So there you have it. I think that the commandants had a great deal of sway over what happened. And I think they did successfully change like quotas in a lot of places at a lot of times, and sometimes they didn't get their way. And they always kind of meet in the middle is how that I think ends up going in terms of over space. And where they tend to alter, where you see alteration and the like more power at the local administrative level does tend to be in Niger and Mauritania, who are, you know, the outliers and everything in this kind of data. So.
Thanks, Lindsey. Are there other questions or comments? Graham, please go ahead.
Great. This is a really cool paper, Lindsey. I just learned a ton from it. This is outside of my usual area, and really especially enjoyed the section on French military recruitment. I've kind of three comments, all kind of like around empirical opportunities here. The first is that the kind of key geographic claims from the three hypotheses that you already have are descriptive, and I wanted them to just like really hit me in the face rather than be in this kind of complex statistical model that I found kind of hard to parse and link back to the hypotheses. But it seems like and this may be already in the appendix, but just having rates of recruitment, volunteerism, and absenteeism for places with and without railways, places in the periphery versus at the center, places with pre-colonial centralization and not, as kind of like table 2 after the descriptives, I think would really help, because it seems like looking at the map, the patterns are pretty stark, and so I think developing a set of just like very, very simple descriptives will really make the data this awesome data that you collected sing. Second, when reading the theoretical section, I got really excited from the perspective that a great theory should have many empirical implications. And so I saw lots of rich hypotheses that Joan and Dominika have picked up on also that could be tested. So a couple of ideas. One, can you look at times of exigencies and see if the rates of recruitment go up in difficult to recruit places, or if rates of absenteeism go up as people cross borders? Second, picking up on Dominika's comment on economic opportunities. I understand your kind of concerns about droughts, but it seems like a measure of unusual changes in rainfall, which a couple of studies have used. Maybe especially big long periods of unusually low rainfall would address the concerns you had that you're just picking up cross-sectional variation that's sort of time invariant. And they're used in this kind of design, you might just be looking at within area changes over time rather than relying on the between. And so just looking at before and after those large deviations. Third, picking up on Joan's comment about policy changes, it seems like a set of kind of sort of quantitative case studies of particular policy changes. So Joan suggested event studies seems like a really fruitful way to go, where you can just start by diving into particular little changes and figuring out whether there's empirical leverage there. I guess like for me, like I wouldn't worry about like creating a variable that you can include in this massive regression, but rather zooming in on particular changes where they affected recruitment and absenteeism, and where they didn't and when, etc. Finally, it seems like maybe the biggest opportunity across all these places is in the railways and in the expansion of the railways. And so building a story in here, which I don't have enough information to completely form, but building a story about pre and post railway construction recruitment rates. And so it seems like the key first step there is like, why are the railways built in the particular places that they are in each of these colonies, and then whether you can develop on substantive grounds a defense of a parallel pre-trends kind of assumption between some set of places that didn't have railways and some that did, and then compare rates of these three outcomes. It seems like really zooming in there and kind of throwing away the rest of the empirical exercise and just trying to look at places that have just gotten railway access and not could be a really promising next step. So just a few ideas. I think this is really exciting and definitely look forward to seeing where it goes next.
Lindsey, is there anything you want to respond to for that, or?
On your second point, I'm going to email you and ask you what you found that could be like a pre and post on unusual weather patterns. I would like to know more about this. So please share. And I have run, I think, some like really basic models. I don't even know if they're in the appendix that try to isolate the railway. I don't know why I did not include those in like the current draft's main body. I don't remember. But I could go back and try to rethink why and do so.
Thanks, Lindsey. Nicholas, please go ahead.
So yeah, I wasn't going to speak because Lindsey has heard me all too often. But I did, and Lindsey will, you know, I sent you that book on the construction of the railroad in Congo-Brazzaville. And it occurred to me that, I mean, so the role of the railroads is always given in all the historiography as a sort of a net benefit and a cause of spatial differentiation on a number of variables. But what was really striking about this new book on the railroad is that it was like it had a dreadful reputation, and it had a negative effect on labor relations and colonial recruitment on an array of different issues for like 15 years, because basically working on the railroad was a complete death trap. And so when colonial officers came into the countryside, people disappeared because they didn't want to have to work on the railroad. And so it occurred to me that the economic cost of the construction of the railroad and the impact on labor relations and more broadly administration subject relations must have been significant. I mean, this is really just a detail, but it did strike me that the impact of the railroads should be thought of in multiple ways, I think.
Thank you so much. I see Dominika has her hand up too, so maybe we'll take that question as well. Thanks.
Yeah, so I just had, well, since we have time, I just had one follow-up question about sort of thinking about the temporal variation versus sectional variation. So, Lindsey, I couldn't tell like how stable patterns are. So for example, when you show these figures, such as figure 2 and 3, that really nicely show sort of rates of absenteeism, but they are averages. I'm just sort of curious how stable they are over time. So are the places that have, higher rates at one point, do they consistently have higher rates? Or are there, because, and then in particular, when we, juxtapose those with figure 5 and 6 that show temporal variations for very specific locations. One of the things that also strikes me about those is that the early 1920s seem to be very unstable. I mean, well, I don't know, I don't know how representative these places are, but just looking at these ones, they seem very unstable. And then sort of after the mid-20s, it seems to be more stable. Is the more stable period, does that give you more leverage in terms of thinking about the sort of cross-regional variation? I'm not even sure if this is, if this just relates to these particular places, or is this a trend? But they do have these really wild spikes early on and not so much later. I don't know if there is something to be deduced from that.
Yes, so the wild spike in the 20s is pretty universal. That's everywhere that move. So it's this institutionalization process of conscription is in the early 1920s, and you see like a very clear spike as soon as basically the census is completed and any kind of recruitment is basically taken out of the hands of the chiefs. You see these massive changes that then kind of stabilize after you get like 1 or 2 years of the draft. So there are really like wild temporal dynamics at play. So in terms of the kind of maps over time and the consistency, there are really clear changes. So what I see when I look at, and sometimes I wish that this paper could just be maps and everybody could just draw their conclusions from looking at pretty maps. So if you like really pare down on one country and you look at, say, the rate of like draft evasion and where the absentees are, you see enormous variation really early on, like very striking variation. And that does tend to kind of taper into a more consistent degree over time. But then what you get are a couple kind of standout districts that aren't behaving in that way. So it's like in Benin, you have one district that kind of meets that kind of average across the colony. And then you'll have, I think it's Cotonou is like absolutely not changing. They are just like very consistently like refusing to show up for the draft. So you do see that like a couple districts will always, and usually at these fringes or around the railways, which is why these like stand out in the data, are like not fitting the broader trend of kind of everybody kind of meeting at the average, if that makes sense. So the maps are very cool. I wish you could break them down.
Thanks, Lindsey. Joan, do you have a,
Yeah, I have, I guess, two comments or three. One is that to follow up on what Graham and Nick were saying, I'm not an expert on railroads, first of all, in Africa or anywhere, but I have not read any book that says the primary or even secondary purpose of the railroad, be it the, the East Africa Railroad in going through Kenya and Uganda, or the Dakar St. Louis Railroad, you name it, was to conscript, or to entice volunteers and whatnot. So in that helps you. And so that's why I agree that Graham's last comment is potentially interesting for you to leverage this over time variation. So that's one comment. A second comment is that there's something in the paper that you don't say anything about, but reading some of that stuff when I was in grad school, we tend to think of the British as the, as the preeminent guys classifying people into martial races, be it in South Asia or be it in East and West Africa. But the French did their share. And so, for instance, as Western Senegal developed relative to other places in AOF, you see that some French administrators engage in the same racial stereotypes as the British were doing, So I remember reading this book, I could try to find it, but I remember the quote very well, saying, the Wolof has become a snob, and they are not good to become Senegalese derrière, and so on. So you would see something similar with the British in South Asia, or in the case of Uganda, they would say it with the Baganda and so on. So why am I saying this? Because this is something that's not discussed in the paper, but if you think that, that's interesting, then that's potentially different angle. I don't know if it's new paper or something different to generate any hypothesis to write something different, but to what extent did these racist stereotypes affect recruitment patterns of conscription and or enticing volunteers? Now, if anyone who gets into some of the research in Sub-Saharan Africa in the early 1900s knows that what was called policy in theory was a hot mess in practice. So it may be the case that there's a lot of noise and exposed rationalization of district commanders and so on, this kind of racist stereotyping. But if there's something more systematic in French West Africa, as there was in, say, British South Asia, or to some extent British East Africa, that would be something that I have not seen any paper showing in a systematic way that racist stereotyping affected things like conscription. This was there in Senegal. It was there. I remember, Leonard Wanchek, I took one of his classes in grad school, and he was telling us about the same thing in Benin, and how the French, in fact, got it exactly wrong on that kind of. Anyway, bottom line is, I don't know if this is systematic or not, but it would be, and I know this is kind of a tangential comment, it would be potentially a very interesting avenue to see if some of the stuff that some historian has said actually bears out in recruitment numbers. So that's the second comment. And the third and last, and this will be quick, I do think, and that kind of is a bit of what I didn't say when I was making the initial comments, that there's so much in the model that you give us, and I guess a bit like Graham, I would like to see the basics first. How can we see a simple model, perhaps also, with fixed effects without a lag, that doesn't kill so much of the variations? It's hard to know, what's controlling for what's killing what variation. So you kind of bring this big hammer, and so perhaps that would be a less ambitious model will actually be clear for the reader. Then there's also, perhaps it doesn't help that I have to say the notation was a bit unclear, because I actually tried. But besides issues of notation, I think there's a more substantive issue of trying to start from the basics, I guess, is my point, and then move on to leveraging policy changes, as we mentioned earlier. Once the basic patterns perhaps are conveyed to the reader in a relatively simple way. So that's the third and last comment that I wanted to bring up.
I'm happy to do that. I just struggle with the temporal plus the geographic variation. It's just, there's so much going on that I have struggled a lot with that, and always happy to improve it. So I do have like a very baby working paper that specifically addresses the kind of like racial dynamics of this. It's such a huge topic, is why it's not in this paper. It would be just derails everything. So my, just like for future reference, my general takeaway and what I'm like trying to do is that I look at like resistance in World War I, and then and how that influences where recruitment, not just like volunteerism or absenteeism, is altered. What I generally, and then and this is where it's like complicated and why it's a baby working paper, is because it's going to be another like very like troubling descriptive mess. But so what I think I'm finding is that where it was like a good deal of violent pushback in the First World War, you do see pretty like steep declines in recruitment for a very brief amount of time. So like for 5 years, say, in Burkina Faso, you see a little bit less, and then those effects disappear. But what you do see are these kind of lingering stereotypes after that time. And there are, limits to that. So, the really clear racial difference is with the Poulard. The French, drastically limited the amount of recruitment they wanted to do anywhere they thought that there were going to be Pole communities. Although their like ability to disaggregate that was not great. So you see that mostly in Guinea, and then a little in Senegal, but then they kind of, can't disaggregate. So I'm like trying to figure out how to leverage this, like kind of these time trends with some of the descriptive work. And then I think one thing I might have to do to like really get into that is go back to some of these like health statistics to see where like, the only place that the French recorded ethnicity or race really systematically within any kind of system of recruitment was when they were doing any kind of medical exam. Like that's the only time that they name it, like who they're removing because they think they're like not strong enough. And like, it's kind of a mess. It's interesting, and also like anything I do with like questions of race and ethnicity, like, and these kind of constructions of OCDs, I want to do like very carefully. So it'll be a paper someday.
Thanks, Lindsey. We have time for one more question if anyone has something. Okay, well, I was just wondering, Lindsey, and I mean, this might be a little bit difficult. I know times of COVID and things have shifted things, but I'm just wondering, love to hear more about your how this fits into your potential dissertation topic and what you're thinking of and where you're going. If you do not have an answer to that, I know that this is complicated given, that is absolutely okay, and you can just say so. But I was just curious because it seems like you have a lot here and a lot kind of moving on. So I'm just curious to see how that fits into what you're planning for the future.
I can see Nick waiting for me to answer that question. So in terms of the original dissertation I planned to write, I don't know how it would clearly tie in. So what I've been doing is kind of working on two fronts in the dissertation that I want to write, which may be like a book, but not the dissertation. And then what I'm not entirely sure how to draw all these different pieces of the all of this data I've collected with this on colonialism into a cohesive whole, but I've been trying to kind of make that intellectual leap over the last couple months. And right, so I wish I had a better answer for that.
No, that is completely fair. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I just want to say, like, part of that is, I think it is, and Dominika said this, but it is really impressive, the data that you have been able to collect, and the archival data. I was commenting to Joan before, like, it is impressive to see the detail, with which this has occurred. And, much like Dominika, I'm really curious to see future work, particularly that draws on some of this qualitative data and this rich qualitative data that I'm sure you've gathered alongside, this coding that you've done. So I think we can all say that we're excited for your future work and to see where this goes and what you do. And I know that this is changing.
If people are really really like the qualitative stuff, I am more than happy to get into the weeds and like write a good chunk of like really descriptive stuff, and maybe the dissertation can be a site for that. Without giving up on the interviews I will complete.
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting as you do that, particularly to really start to think about these mechanisms and why you're seeing what you're seeing. I think that can potentially be really useful. Well, I just want to, we're coming up to 9:30, and I just want to thank everyone for being here. Lindsey, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. It's really fantastic. Dominika and Joan, thank you so much for taking the time to act as discussants. Thank you so much for your thoughtful comments, and thank you to everyone in the audience. I really appreciate, very thoughtful comments and engagement with Lindsey's work. And, please do follow up with each other. I know that there was, certain things, so please do follow up with each other after. And if you need links, you can always emails and stuff, but you can always email me. We will be posting the online colloquium within the week or next week. We're also in the process of planning potential summer, but just certainly fall online colloquiums. So certainly, follow us and keep abreast of future online colloquiums and other events that we'll be holding. And thank you all so much for being here and taking the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Good to see you all.